Hey everyone! Today, we're stepping back into the strange, dazzling, and sometimes unsettling world of the Renaissance, an age where art brushed against alchemy, where masked revelers danced while plague bells tolled, and where beauty often hid as much darkness as it revealed. Before we begin, if you enjoy these kinds of deep dives into history, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to keep wandering through these stories with me. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing how far these echoes of the past are reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a candle flicker nearby, and settle into your chair. Take a deep breath, and let's walk together into the Renaissance, its brilliance, its secrets, and its shadows. Close your eyes and dim the lights. Take a deep breath, and step with me into the year 1494. The city is Florence, but not the Florence you know from the postcards and the coffee table books. This one stinks. The air tastes of smoke and sewage, of incense masking something far worse. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, not for the hour, but for the dead. You walk through narrow streets that twist like veins, their stones slick with something you don't want to name. Above you, rickety wooden balconies creak as shadows pass. Are they thieves? Priests? Or just another poor soul waiting for the plague to decide their fate? A torch sputters in the wind, throwing grotesque shapes on the plaster walls. You pull your cloak tighter, but it doesn't keep out the chill. Or the smell. Or the whispers. There are always whispers here, of alchemists boiling strange metals in hidden rooms, of secret brotherhoods meeting under cover of darkness, of bodies, too many bodies, being carried quietly out of houses by men who don't stop to pray. This is the Renaissance, the so-called rebirth. But look closely, and you'll see the rot under the gilding, a city of genius and filth, of Michelangelo's David, and rats in the rafters, of philosophers preaching enlightenment, while the poor starve on their doorstep. You hear it now, the low drone of a psalm from a church ahead. And beneath it, the laughter of drunkards in a brothel across the street. The sacred and the profane sharing an alley, either surprised by the other. Welcome to the dark side of the Renaissance. Poverty, plague, alchemy, secret societies, and all the things your textbooks politely forgot to mention. Now, shall we walk deeper? The paintings lie to you. You know the ones, glorious Renaissance frescoes, saints with golden halos, noblemen in velvet doublets, marble statues that seem too perfect to be human. They sell you a story, that the Renaissance was a time of pure beauty, enlightenment, and unbroken progress. A world where Michelangelo could chisel David by day, and Da Vinci could draft flying machines by candlelight at night, while Florence and Venice hummed like well-oiled utopias. But step down from the frescoes. Lower your eyes from the cathedral domes to the streets. Smell the air. Listen to the people. It's not so divine anymore. The Renaissance wasn't just a golden age, it was also an age of rot. Imagine Florence, circa 1500. A city of artists, bankers, philosophers, and beggars. For every Medici counting his florins in a candlelit study, there were 10 desperate peasants huddled in filthy alleys, shivering under threadbare cloaks. The same city that commissioned Botticelli's Birth of Venus also had slums where children died before their 5th birthday, where prostitution wasn't a choice but a means to not starve, where petty thieves could lose a hand for stealing bread while nobles held feasts that could feed 100. That's the first thing you need to know. The Renaissance was a hierarchy with teeth. We tend to think of Renaissance Florence or Venice as dazzling jewels, but walk their streets and you'll see why some travelers wrote about the stench before they wrote about the art. Waste flowed through open drains. Beggars lined the bridges, their hands outstretched, their bodies covered in sores. Orphans roamed in packs, pickpocketing or offering themselves to whoever would pay. In Florence, a city of about 60,000 in 1500, as many as a third of the population lived in poverty. The city kept poor lists, official registers of those so destitute they received alms from the church or the state. These weren't lazy vagrants, as some elites like to claim. They were often widows, laborers out of work, or peasants who had fled the countryside after bad harvests. And the Medici? They were patrons of the arts, yes, but also of control. They bankrolled the glory of Florence with one hand while keeping a tight grip on its politics with the other. They built chapels with frescoes that sang of divine charity, while quietly ensuring that any unrest in the streets was put down hard. Where there's desperation, there's crime. Thievery was rampant. Not the elegant, gentleman thieves of romantic tales, but grubby, hungry people stealing whatever they could, loaves of bread, bolts of cloth, even firewood. Pickpockets stalked the marketplaces. Burglars broke into the homes of merchants who had made their fortunes trading silks and spices. And then there was the sex trade. Prostitution, far from being an underground vice, was openly tolerated, even regulated. In Florence, the city council operated official brothels, ostensibly to protect honorable women by keeping men from harassing them. Venetian authorities did the same, even going so far as to require prostitutes to wear yellow scarves so they could be identified. It wasn't about morality. It was about control and revenue. And where the state didn't reach, gangs did. Renaissance cities weren't policed in the modern sense. Instead, they were carved up by neighborhood factions, sometimes family-based, sometimes organized criminal groups. Florence's streets were infamous for brawls between rival clans, a hangover from medieval vendettas that even the rise of humanism couldn't kill. The Renaissance wasn't a gentle, peaceful awakening. It was unstable, volatile, and often bloody. Florence saw repeated uprisings, most famously the Ciampi Revolt of 1378, when wool workers, the lowest of the city's guild laborers, rose against their wealthy overlords. They stormed the government, demanding representation, only to be crushed within a few years. Similar revolts erupted across Italy as workers and the poor realized that rebirth didn't mean much for them. And then came the preachers, fiery men like Girolamo Savonarola, who in the 1490s convinced Florentines that their city's luxury was an offense to God. He called for a bonfire of the vanities, where citizens tossed their fine clothes, cosmetics, and even paintings into the flames. For a brief, strange moment, Florence became a theocracy, before Savonarola himself was burned at the stake in the very square where he had held his sermons. Can you picture it? One year, Florence is commissioning Botticelli. The next, it's throwing his paintings into the fire. This was the Renaissance, a place where humanism and hysteria walked hand in hand. The wealthy patrons who gave us the Renaissance weren't benevolent philanthropists. They were power players. The Medici didn't just pay for art out of love for beauty, they used it to advertise their dominance. When they funded Michelangelo's David, it wasn't just a sculpture. It was a political statement. Look, it said, Florence is strong. Florence is righteous. And Florence belongs to us. Meanwhile, the commoners saw little of this glory. They might wander into a church and gape at the frescoes, but then they'd go home to houses with dirt floors and straw beds, where hunger gnawed through the night. This contradiction is the beating heart of the Renaissance, a time when the same city could birth the genius of Leonardo and the misery of thousands who would never even learn to read his name. So let's walk together. Down a narrow Florentine alley, the cobblestones slick with last night's rain, and maybe something else. We pass a wealthy banker's palazzo, its stone walls rising like a fortress, and then, just a few steps later, we're in a neighborhood where families of 6 share a single room. Overhead, laundry sways between windows. Below, a beggar with no legs drags himself toward us, hand outstretched. You hear it all at once. The clink of coins in a merchant's purse, the soft sob of a mother who's lost her child to fever, the laughter of young men on their way to a tavern brawl. This isn't the sanitized Renaissance of textbooks. This is the real one. Beautiful and brutal. Holy and profane. And we're only just beginning. The bell tolls again. Not for the hour this time. It's the heavy, deliberate toll you feel in your bones, a death bell. We're still in Florence, but now we're heading toward the outskirts, toward a building you wouldn't mistake for a church or a palace. This is a plague hospital, one of the many grim landmarks scattered across Renaissance Italy, places where the air is thick with incense and vinegar, and where the living and the dying lie separated only by a thin, trembling hope. See, here's the cruel truth about the Renaissance. The Black Death never really left. The pandemic of 1347 to 1351 killed somewhere between 30% and 60% of Europe's population. But the Renaissance wasn't a neat line from darkness to light. It was a messy, bloody smear. The plague came back. Again. And again. In Florence alone, there were at least 6 major outbreaks between 1400 and 1500. Imagine surviving one only to watch your children or your neighbors die in the next wave. If you lived in this so-called rebirth of civilization, you lived with death at your elbow. Picture it. Narrow streets with no sewage system. Rats scurrying along the alleys. Fleas carrying the invisible curse. A merchant returning from Genoa with goods, and with infection. A single ship docking in Venice could mean hundreds of coffins within weeks. When plague returned, cities transformed overnight. Shops closed. Taverns emptied. Nobles fled to their country estates, leaving the poor behind to die. Priests refused to enter homes for last rites. Doctors stopped visiting their patients. And those who remained, the gravediggers, the midwives, the charity workers, they moved like ghosts through a city of the condemned. You would smell the sickness before you saw it. The combination of incense meant to ward off evil, the sour reek of vinegar-soaked cloth, and the sweet, rotting stench of death clinging to the air. Here's something that might surprise you. The Renaissance gave us quarantine. The very word comes from 40 giorni, 40 days. That's how long ships had to wait offshore in Venetian ports before passengers could disembark, a desperate attempt to stop the spread. And while it didn't always work, it shows you something fascinating. This wasn't a time of pure superstition. They didn't know about bacteria, but they noticed patterns. They knew that isolation helped. And so they tried. But for every sensible measure, there were 10 born of sheer terror. You've probably seen them, the famous plague doctors in their beaked masks. They weren't just for show. Those masks were stuffed with herbs and spices, juniper, rose, camphor, because they believed plague spread through miasma, or bad air. It didn't work, but it gave them courage to walk into hell. People burned rosemary and sage in their homes, hoping the smoke would cleanse the air. They wore charms, little amulets etched with prayers or mysterious symbols, thinking they could cheat death. One Florentine record tells of a man who drank powdered emerald mixed with wine to fortify his humors. Another chronicler, a doctor, wrote with weary resignation that he led the dying until they had nothing left to bleed. It didn't work. But desperate people don't wait for peer-reviewed studies. Living through plague meant learning to dance with death. Funerals were rushed. Coffins were reused. In some outbreaks, so many died that corpses were dumped into mass graves, sprinkled with lime, and forgotten. People said they saw carts piled with the dead trundling past their windows at dawn. Some wrote about it later, like one Venetian diarist who confessed that he avoided the eyes of the dying because to look at them was to feel the chill of my own grave. Another doctor described the silence of abandoned streets as a psalm of despair. And yet, life went on. It had to. Bakers kept baking. Market stalls reopened between outbreaks. Lovers still met in secret, because what was there to lose? It gave rise to a culture obsessed with memento mori. Remember you will die. Art bloomed with skeletons dancing alongside the living, skulls carved into rosaries, frescoes of the Virgin cradling not a child, but the plague-stricken. The Renaissance wasn't just about celebrating life. It was about learning how to stare death in the face and keep creating anyway. Let's walk out of this plague house together. The bells keep tolling. You see a funeral procession, mourners in plain black cloaks, walking quickly, avoiding eye contact. Across the square, a group of children play with a tattered ball, their laughter strangely defiant in the shadow of death. This is the Renaissance in its rawest form. A city half alive, half dead. And as we follow that funeral procession, slowly, into the narrow heart of Florence, the air changes. The incense fades. The smell of death gives way to the sourness of human sweat, the grease of cooking fires, the musk of too many bodies packed too close together. We're leaving the city of the dead and entering the city of the living, or what passes for living here. The slums of Florence, where plague survivors linger, where orphans beg for scraps, where the Renaissance looks far less like a rebirth, and more like survival with a fancy name. And that is where our next steps take us. We follow the trail of the funeral procession, weaving through narrow alleys until the church bells fade into memory. The air grows warmer, heavier. The stench of vinegar and incense is replaced by something more human: sweat, stale bread, cooking oil. Muffled voices. The clatter of wooden boards. This is the slum, the city behind the facade, Florence's underbelly. In Florence, poverty was visible in every nook. The same lanes Alighieri might have wandered were crowded with ragged souls. Chroniclers estimate that 1 in 3 Florentines lived in extreme hardship. Laborers laid off by bad harvests, widows stripped of dowries, orphans turned thieves just to stay alive. There were official Mandi di Piedad, alms offices, church-run pawn shops where desperate people exchanged belongings for bread or coin. While charitable in name, they were also debt traps, pushing the destitute into endless cycles of obligation. People whispered of children, barefoot, clutching bits of bread, roving in gangs. Some scavenged sewage drains for scraps, others offered their bodies to secure a loaf. A Florentine memoir from 1475 describes a woman with a newborn curled to her breast, begging at the Ponte Vecchio. Her face was so sunken, so hollow, it was as if the city had drawn the life from her. But Florence wasn't unique. Step into Venice, and the poverty takes on a watery shuffle. The city glitters by day, merchant ships, frescoed palazzi, gondolas drifting beneath marble bridges. But behind those facades lie back alleys soggy with human waste, crowded fondici, and homes where entire families lived in 1 2-meter cell. One Venetian official recorded that fully 40% of the Republic's population, over 60,000 people in the lagoon city, subsisted in conditions barely above starvation. Their dwellings were called squat casini, narrow houses crammed between canals, often with half the space claimed by widows, laborers, and boatmen. We pass a canal-side doorway painted in ghostly yellow. Once, that marked a brothel, officially licensed. Today, an old woman thrashes at vermin in the corner, and children cry from a single bed. Pigeons cluster overhead, pecking at scraps. Someone sells stale polenta at a corner stall, the smell tangy and acrid in the humid air. Venice regulated prostitution, you've heard this, requiring women to wear yellow scarves. But regulation didn't mean protection. It meant exploitation. Many came from inland villages, fleeing famine, sold by relatives to the madams of Venice. Charity records speak of trafficked girls dying within months, families branded as traitors. Now imagine strolling through Rome, pilgrims streaming towards St. Peter's, nobles flaunting velvet robes, artists painting churches in gold and lapis lazuli. But the outskirts, the Rioni neighborhoods near the Tiber, are a different world. Rome's poverty was tied to its nature as a pilgrimage hub. Seasonal surges of pilgrims swallowed up resources. Sometimes 1,000 pilgrims could arrive in a single day, overwhelming food supplies and lodging. The result: diseases, inflated prices, and beggars, many cured or crippled, lining every route. Records from 1492 describe the area near Porto di Ripetta. Crowds sick and gaunt, parents offering children they cannot feed, monks giving scraps, Rome had charitable confraternities, yes, but many were affiliated with powerful families and served their interests first. For the truly destitute, daily survival meant scavenging riverbanks, begging at Corte Leonesca, or skipping meals entirely. In the city center, the Ospedale di Santo Spirito provided some relief, but there were rumors of corpses unclaimed, dumped in hidden courtyards so as not to arrest the tourist's eye. One pilgrim wrote, "I saw them bury strangers in courtyards behind curtained walls, so that pilgrims in the square would not lose faith." Across these cities, a pattern repeats. Disease, famine, and displacement pushed rural populations into cities, where demand for cheap labor exceeded supply. Rising rents and food prices made tiny dwellings unaffordable, forcing the poor into slum clusters or makeshift shelters. Charitable institutions, while present, prioritized the control of the poor, through lists, oversight, forced labor, more than alleviating suffering. Crime and survival strategies, begging, prostitution, theft, were not deviant but adaptive in a society that offered no safety net. Let's walk deeper into Florence again, slum adjacent. We pass a courtyard. The ground is packed dirt. Rats flee as we step near. Above, laundry flaps between buildings, a kaleidoscope of linen and rags. A woman kneels over a wooden bowl, boiling remnants of cabbage and water, the smell sickly sweet. Children tug at her skirts. A nearby stall sells tobacco and wine, luxuries within reach for the few. Most buy stale polenta or stale bread in twos, chewed with rancid lard. The sounds, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoing off stone, distant church bells mingling with coughing and a child's cry. In Venice, we push past the canal bank. The quayside is lined with workers unloading grain sacks. They cough between tasks, faces dusty. Between boats lie canals stained green, sewage trickles through cracks. In a corner, a mother weeps quietly, her youngest is too weak to stand. Vagabond scribes scribble politics on parchments nearby, discussing glories of the Republic, while the squalor spreads beside them. In Rome, the Tiber's floodplain floods low-lying Rioni. We drift past simmering pots of soup ladled to the homeless by monks from Santo Spirito. We see men chained to debtors' prisons, women crying for alms. Pilgrims cross themselves as they pass, but often toss a coin into a box addressed to the dead. They see the suffering in turn, praying it doesn't touch them. When tags read Florence, Venice, Rome, poverty gave rise to hidden markets. Florence had a thriving illicit trade in stolen silks and counterfeit florins, fenced in back alleys. Stories tell of market gangs, orphans turned pickpockets, who organized their own slum courts. Leaders enforced taxes on poor traders and punished offenders with ear cropping. Venice developed a black market in salt, fish, and prostitution. Even salt, normally controlled by the state, was smuggled to the poor to keep costs low. Prison records mention gang fights over control of salt routes. Rome's outskirts saw miraculous relics sold cheaply to gullible pilgrims, even some associated with underground sects offering illicit charms. Magic and healing merged in poverty zones. A plaster healer might sell tokens of saints alongside sorceress tinctures. These hidden economies were survival, fraud, magic, theft. They arose because official alms often required surrender of freedom or labor. Being poor meant choosing between exploitation and self-defense. There are whispers recorded in letters and diaries. A Florentine craftsman's wife wrote of her children. They wake hungry, their ribs sharp through thin linen. I collect twigs for fuel. I pray only that tomorrow I can buy bread. A Venetian midwife noted, I see mothers abandon babies wrapped only in rags. The Tatter Guild forbids me from feeding them. They say it encourages birth. The Tatter Guild was an apocryphal name, but a symbol of institutional cruelty. In Rome, rumors speak of pilgrimage hospitals, where the dying were left to rot behind curtains so that visiting nobles wouldn't be disgusted. A letter mentions that they list the dead only after they've been forgotten. These aren't romanticized. They reveal daily fear, bargaining with starvation, and black humor dark as sewage. One survivor joked that washing clothes was pointless. In 2 hours, they stank again. Brief reflection. Pause. Let the details settle. Food ration stings on your tongue. The sound of a baby crying amidst the timbre shops. Pigeons cooing over trash-strewn squares. Candlelight flickering on stone walls. You realize, the Renaissance glittered for some, but for many it was no different from medieval misery with fancier buildings. Its legacy wasn't just art, it was inequality. Art built by one class, poverty suffered by another. Step carefully. We are entering a different kind of Florence now, not the merchant street, not the artist's studio, but the world of healers and would-be saviors. It smells of smoke and vinegar. The air hangs heavy with burnt rosemary and dried sage. Somewhere close, someone is grinding a pestle against stone, crushing herbs whose names we don't recognize. A door creaks, and a man steps into view. He's wearing a black leather coat, gloves, and that infamous mask, long, bird-beaked, stuffed with pungent herbs. This is a plague doctor, a Renaissance icon that looks almost theatrical to us now. To his patients, he was something between a lifeline and a grim omen. They called him a doctor. But was he a scientist? A priest? A magician? In the Renaissance, those roles weren't so separate. And when death was at the door, you didn't care which one he was, as long as he offered hope. Let's start with the good news. Medicine was changing. Scholars rediscovered Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, building on classical texts. Anatomy studies were advancing, sometimes through quiet, illegal dissections. Universities like Padua and Bologna became hubs of medical debate. But here's the bad news: none of this helped much with plague or common illness. The Renaissance doctor was armed with theory, but not knowledge of germs, immunity, or even basic sterilization. If you caught the plague, you were prescribed things like bloodletting, leeches or lancets to balance the humors, purgatives, potions of aloe, myrrh, or worse, mercury or antimony, to cleanse the body. Dietary regimens: avoid fruit, eat dry bread, drink watered wine. Hope it wasn't laced with lead. Some remedies were so dangerous that they probably killed as many patients as they saved. One Venetian record mentions a wealthy merchant who swallowed powdered pearls and ground emerald to ward off the pestilence. He died within days. That mask wasn't just a fashion statement. Inside the beak, doctors stuffed herbs, juniper berries, mint, camphor, cloves, even sponges soaked in vinegar. They believed in miasma theory. That disease came from bad air. So they walked among the dying like birds of ill omen, clutching wooden canes to examine patients from a distance, or to beat back desperate relatives who begged them to stay. In diaries, people wrote of how unnerving these figures were. One mother described a crowman with a stick who would not speak, who smelled of vinegar and ash. She claimed her children wept at the sight of him. Were they effective? Probably not. But they were brave. They entered homes where even priests feared to tread. And then came the other healers, the ones who didn't wear beat masks but carried crosses, icons, or stranger tools. People wore charms etched with Latin prayers or amulets containing dried toads. In Venice, some tied ribbons soaked in holy water around their necks. In Rome, they might kiss relics of saints or make pilgrimages to shrines known for miracles. One popular belief was that plague came from divine punishment. So the cure? Repentance. Whole groups of flagellants marched through cities, whipping themselves in public squares, chanting prayers, believing their pain could appease God and stop the pestilence. There are letters, half prayer, half superstition, where survivors beg Saint Sebastian, patron saint of plague victims, to intercede. A Florentine chronicler wrote that people hung Sebastian's image over their doors like a ward against death. Now hold your breath, because this is about to get pungent. Homes were fumigated with burning juniper, pine resin, and even animal dung, anything to drive away the bad air. Apothecaries sold sachets of wormwood, rue, and rosemary to carry in one's pockets. Some remedies were deeply bizarre. People were told to sit between two roaring fires to sweat out the poison. Others smeared themselves with onion paste, arsenic salves, or even human excrement, believing that if you stank worse than the plague, it might leave you alone. One rumor claimed that drinking one's own urine could make you immune. In desperation, people did it. And yet, even as we recoil, we have to admit, these weren't fools. They were experimenting with what they had. No microscopes. No antibiotics. No concept of viruses. Just patterns and prayers. Here's where the line between medicine and magic blurs completely. A woman might go to a university-trained doctor by day, then sneak out at night to see a folk healer. These women, sometimes called wise women or cunning folk, used a mix of herbalism, astrology, and Catholic ritual. They'd grind herbs, draw protective symbols in chalk, whisper psalms over the sickbed. In Venice, there were rumors of midwives who practiced astrology to predict whether a child would survive a plague year. In Rome, an apothecary's widow was accused of making potion charms from consecrated bread. The church tolerated some of it, until it didn't. If a remedy worked, it was a miracle. If it failed or smelled of heresy, it was witchcraft. And people whispered, didn't some of these healers actually succeed more often than the doctors? Medicine wasn't just herbs and bloodletting, it was written in the stars. Physicians studied astrological charts, believing the alignment of planets influenced disease. They calculated the plague year by tracking Mars and Saturn. Certain zodiac signs were said to make you more vulnerable. Even Pope Sixtus IV consulted astrologers during outbreaks in Rome. And one Florentine diary recounts how a wealthy banker refused to leave the city until his physician assured him that the moon had passed from Scorpio into Aries. Some so-called remedies were darker than others. There are scattered, horrifying reports of using ground-up mummy powder, looted from Egyptian tombs, as medicine. In Venice, pharmacists sold it in little jars, mumia, they called it, believing that consuming the preserved dead could strengthen the living. Others bled patients until they fainted, thinking weakness meant toxins were leaving the body. One chronicler wrote with disgust of a Roman doctor who bled a boy until his lips turned black, then declared the plague had been driven out. We look back and laugh at the bird masks, the charms, the urine potions. But think, you've watched your neighbors collapse in the street. You've buried your children. Priests tell you this is God's wrath. Doctors talk of humors you cannot see. Wouldn't you burn rosemary, drink emerald dust, or whip yourself raw, if you thought it might save you? Renaissance medicine wasn't stupidity. It was hope with sharp edges. Watch him, our plague doctor, disappearing down the alley, the long beak bobbing, the cane tapping the stones. Behind him, a mother prays over her fevered child, clutching a charm she bought from a cunning woman. Across the square, a friar swings a censer, filling the air with choking incense, as though smoke could keep death out. This is what healing looked like in the Renaissance, a strange alchemy of prayer, folklore, theory, and fear. And we will need to remember this as we take our next steps, because some of these healers were not mere quacks. Some were alchemists, people who believed they could not only heal but transform life itself. That's where we're going next. Into the workshops where fire meets philosophy. Into the minds of those who dreamed they could turn lead into gold, or perhaps find the secret of eternal life. Shall we enter the alchemist's den? Push the door. It resists at first, a heavy wooden thing banded with iron, then gives way with a groan, and we step into a room that is part laboratory, part chapel, part madness. The smell hits you first, sulfur, beeswax, and something sharp like burning metal. It clings to your throat, prickling like smoke, making you want to cough but not daring to, because you sense that to cough here would be to disturb more than dust. This is an alchemist's workshop. The light is low. A single window lets in a shaft of moonlight that illuminates a table piled with glass vessels, copper alembics, and bowls blackened by countless firings. Candles drip wax onto scrolls covered in strange symbols, half Latin, half code, and the margins are filled with drawings, triangles, circles, serpents eating their tails. In the center, a furnace hums, its bellows huffing like a tired beast, and on it sits a flask, its contents a bubbling, golden-green liquid that catches the candlelight and throws it across the room like a spell. You feel it, this place is alive. There he is, bent over the table, his hands stained black, his hair tied back with a strip of cloth. He does not look up. He stirs the bubbling liquid with a glass rod as if adjusting the balance of the universe. This is no ordinary tinkerer. He calls himself a philosopher, not a sorcerer, though others might whisper otherwise. He believes that in this furnace lies more than metal, a key to the mysteries of existence. To the church, men like him tread a thin line between science and heresy. To his neighbors, he's part magician, part madman. To himself, he is an explorer, not of lands, but of the very building blocks of creation. You've heard the cliché. Alchemists wanted to turn lead into gold. And yes, they did. But that was only the surface. Beneath it was a deeper, more mystical goal, the philosopher's stone. A legendary substance said to transmute base metals into gold and, more importantly, grant immortality. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about becoming godlike, achieving perfection. To an alchemist, the transformation of lead into gold mirrored the transformation of the soul, base into pure, mortal into eternal. They called it the great work, magnum opus. And it wasn't just chemistry. It was philosophy, spirituality, and obsession, all in one. Look around. Every object in this room has a purpose. Alembics and retorts, delicate glass vessels for distilling vapors, crucibles, heavy ceramic bowls where metals are melted and purified, mortars and pestles, for grinding minerals, some harmless, others deadly. Manuscripts, written in green language, a coded, symbolic script meant to hide secrets from the uninitiated. Some of these manuscripts might look like prayers. Others read like riddles. One margin scrawl you glimpse. Solve et coagula. Dissolve and recombine. It is the essence of alchemy, breaking things down to remake them into something higher. It would be easy to dismiss this as superstition, but there's real science brewing here. Alchemists laid the groundwork for chemistry, experimenting with acids, discovering distillation, refining metals. The Venetian glassmakers learned their art from alchemical furnaces. Apothecaries borrowed alchemical methods for preparing medicines. Our alchemist might not know about atoms, but he knows how mercury behaves with sulfur, how to extract spirits from wine, how to coax color from minerals. He is an artist of transformation. But this is also a temple. The symbols, serpents, suns, moons, aren't decoration. They represent spiritual truths. For the alchemist, the furnace is the womb of the universe. The bubbling flask? A mirror of the human soul. The great work had stages, each tied to colors and spiritual states. Nigredo, blackening decay, death of the old self. Albedo, widening purification, washing away impurities. Citronitas, yellowing awakening, enlightenment. Rubedo, reddening completion, perfection, gold, the divine. You realize now, alchemy was part science, part meditation, part prayer. This quest wasn't without peril. Alchemists handled mercury, arsenic, lead, poisons that warped their minds and bodies. Many went mad or died young. Some were arrested by the Inquisition for dabbling too close to forbidden arts. Rumors spread. Alchemists consorted with demons, trafficked in heresy, or hoarded their gold for occult rites. It didn't help that their green language looked suspiciously like spellcraft to outsiders. And yet, princes, popes, and merchants funded them. The Medici kept alchemists in their courts. Holy Roman emperors like Rudolph II hosted entire alchemical laboratories in their castles. If there was even a chance of gold or immortality, who wouldn't take it? People whispered of successes. A Venetian alchemist who allegedly produced true gold before vanishing into obscurity. A Florentine who claimed to live off a single elixir for months, sustained by the stone. Nicolas Flamel, the Parisian scribe whose name would echo through centuries as a man who may have achieved the impossible. Were they real? Or myths? The line between truth and legend was as thin as the parchment these stories were written on. Stand here for a moment. Listen to the hiss of the furnace. Watch the glass flasks sweating from the heat. Smell the sharp tang of mercury mingled with incense. You realize this isn't just a workshop. It's a theater of transformation. The alchemist doesn't just want to change lead. He wants to change himself. To ascend. To touch the divine through his crucible. And maybe that's the real philosopher's stone, not a rock, not a potion, but the process of becoming something more than human. The alchemist doesn't look up as we leave. His hands are steady, his eyes fixed on the shimmering liquid in his flask. He might spend the next 10 hours, 10 days, 10 years here, waiting for the moment when the lead turns gold, when the mundane becomes sacred. We close the door behind us, and the smell of sulfur lingers in our clothes. But we take something with us, a sense that the Renaissance wasn't only painted frescoes and marble statues. It was this, too, a world where science was magic, where philosophy burned in furnaces, where men risked their lives to unravel the secrets of the cosmos. And those secrets, those coded circles and serpents, lead us somewhere else. To brotherhoods who swore to guard such knowledge. To groups who operated in the shadows of cathedrals and palaces, carrying these mysteries forward. Secret societies. And that is where we go next. The door shuts behind us, and the streets are gone. No more marketplace chatter, no distant church bells. Only stone walls pressing in, damp and cold. We're in a cellar beneath some Renaissance palazzo, maybe in Florence, maybe in Venice, maybe in Rome. It doesn't matter. These places exist in all three cities. The air is close. You smell wax, iron, and the faint bite of incense. There's no daylight here. Only candles set in iron sconces, their flames painting the walls with trembling gold. And then you see them. Figures in dark hooded robes gathered in a circle. Silent. Hands folded, heads bowed. At first glance, they could be monks. But there's no crucifix in this room, no priest at the altar. Instead, at the center of the circle lies a table draped in black cloth. On it, a book bound in leather, a set of compasses, and a sword whose blade catches the candlelight like a shard of frozen fire. Welcome to the underworld of the Renaissance, the secret societies. The Renaissance made room for ideas too dangerous to say aloud. The Church tolerated some humanism, but only to a point. Question too much, seek knowledge too freely, and you could be branded a heretic, or worse. So thinkers, artisans, and even nobles formed brotherhoods, semi-hidden networks where dangerous ideas could live. They drew on Neoplatonism, Hermetic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and early Masonic ideals. They studied alchemy, astrology, and esoteric symbols, not for idle curiosity, but because they believed such knowledge could elevate mankind. These were not drunken tavern clubs. They were oaths-bound communities. To join was to swear silence, loyalty, and often, obedience to the brotherhood over all else. The roots of Freemasonry? You can trace them here. Stonemason guilds of the Middle Ages, keepers of architectural knowledge, evolved in the Renaissance into something stranger. Some lodges began admitting not just builders, but intellectuals, artists, and even statesmen, who met under the guise of craft. They shared coded handshakes, symbolic tools, and a language of secrecy. The square and compass weren't just tools, they were philosophical emblems of order, balance, and divine geometry. It was said that in these lodges, A prince could speak with a carpenter as an equal. Inside, social hierarchy blurred. Outside, it snapped back like a whip. And though these groups often claimed to exist for moral improvement and mutual aid, they had another role: political leverage. In Florence, lodges whispered about Medici policies. In Venice, they tracked the power games of the Council of Ten. There were other, stranger societies, too. Groups influenced by the Corpus Hermeticum, a set of mystical writings believed to contain the wisdom of ancient Egypt. These texts, translated by scholars like Marsilio Ficino under Medici patronage, fueled a new vision of man, not as a sinner groveling for salvation, but as a divine spark capable of transcending his limits. Some of these brotherhoods would later be associated with the Rosicrucian movement, a blend of Christian mysticism, alchemy, and occult science. They believed they were heirs to secret wisdom passed down through hidden lines of sages, from Pythagoras to the Magi to their own time. One Venetian diarist claimed that these invisible colleges were libraries of living men, whose tongues speak the forbidden truths of God and nature. Whether that was awe or accusation, it's hard to say. The hooded figures stir. One steps forward, an older man, his face shadowed. He motions for you to approach the table. You see the objects more clearly now. The book is filled with geometric diagrams and cryptic symbols, triangles interlocked with circles, serpents coiled around suns. The sword is ceremonial, its hilt engraved with Latin, lux in tenebris licet. The light shines in the darkness. The man speaks, not loud, but in a voice that fills the room. To know, you must vow. To vow, you must leave behind the self you were. This is initiation. Not just into a group, but into an idea, that knowledge is power, and that power must be protected by silence. Everything in this room is layered with meaning. The circle, perfection, unity, eternity. The square and compass, measure and moral order. The serpent eating its tail, Ouroboros death feeding life, endings birthing beginnings. They write in cipher texts, not just to keep secrets, but because they believed true wisdom could not be written plainly. It had to be hidden, earned, and unlocked. Even their meeting places are encoded: a basement under a palazzo, a chapel after midnight, a warehouse by the Arno. Anywhere shadows keep curious eyes at bay. Don't think these were fringe cranks hiding from the world. They had powerful friends. The Medici are said to have patronized Hermetic circles. Cosimo de' Medici himself bankrolled Ficino's translations of Hermetic texts, not out of idle curiosity, but because he believed they contained a theology older than Moses. In Venice, some whispered that even members of the Council of Ten, the city's most feared political body, kept ties to esoteric lodges. In Rome, rumors claimed that cardinals dabbled in astrology and alchemy under the guise of scholarly study. These societies weren't rebelling against power. They were woven into it. Did they plot in these rooms? Probably. But maybe not in the way modern conspiracies imagine. Some brotherhoods acted as networks of patronage, trading information, favors, and influence. Others leaned more spiritual, focusing on mystical initiation and moral reform. But their secrecy made them a target. One Florentine preacher called them spiders spinning webs in the dark. Another Venetian chronicler accused them of holding the Republic hostage with whispered oaths. The man closes the book, and the circle breaks. One by one, the hooded figures extinguish the candles. We are led back to the stairs, the heavy door groaning as it opens. The cool night air of Florence, or perhaps Venice, rushes over us like a blessing. Behind us, the room goes dark, but the sense of it lingers. A place where politics met mysticism, where men believed that by studying the hidden order of the universe, they might gain the power to shape it. And it makes you wonder, how much of the Renaissance was decided not in open forums or council halls, but in rooms like this, by hooded figures, speaking in whispers, holding swords and compasses under the light of flickering candles? Next, We follow the thread of faith deeper into the shadows. Because not all these movements stayed hidden in stone cellars. Some spilled into open conflict with the church. Some became heresies. And that's where we go now. The street is silent. You step out from the cellar of the Brotherhood, still carrying the weight of its whispers, and into a Renaissance night that smells of wood smoke and wet stone. Above, the cathedral bells toll softly, marking the hour of Compline, the church's final prayers for the day. But we're not heading for the cathedral. We follow a different trail. One that moves away from the bright-lit naves and into alleys where faith wears other faces. Where religion has slipped past the grip of priests and cardinals and taken on its own, unruly forms. It's here, in the cracks of Christendom, that you find the hidden faithful, some praying for new revelations, some for survival, some for a God who feels closer than the one preached in gilded pulpits. This is the borderland between piety and persecution. And we are crossing into it. A woman meets us at the corner, cloaked, head low. She doesn't speak, just gestures. We follow her through a series of twisting alleys, past shuttered shops and crumbling walls marked with faint chalk symbols. Finally, she opens a wooden door, nothing grand, just a carpenter's workshop by day, and ushers us inside. There, by candlelight, a dozen people sit in a circle. Their faces are tense, expectant. At the center stands a man with wild hair and eyes that seem lit from within. He holds a Bible, but the words he preaches sound strange. He talks of a church corrupted by gold and sin, of Christ's message drowned beneath papal crowns and indulgence cellars. He claims that the poor are nearer to God than the bishops who lord over them. He says that the Spirit speaks not through Rome but through each of them, directly. To the Vatican, this man is a heretic. To these listeners? A prophet. This scene isn't unique. Long before Luther nailed his theses to a church door, there were others, Waldensians in the Alps, Lollards in England, Hussites in Bohemia, who dared to strip away church authority and preach a simpler, purer Christianity. The Renaissance church crushed many of them. Waldensians were hunted like wolves. Jan Hus burned at the stake in 1415. Yet their ideas didn't die. They smoldered, whispered in secret rooms like this one. And with each new outrage, another tithe demanded, another indulgence sold, the smolder grew hotter. In Florence, you still hear the echo of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who once turned the city into a theocracy of fire and fear. He thundered from the pulpit against Medici wealth and church corruption. He presided over the infamous bonfire of the vanities, where people burned their jewelry, their paintings, even their books to cleanse themselves of sin. For a moment, Florence obeyed him. But prophets who claim too much power draw dangerous attention. In 1498, the Pope excommunicated him. Soon after, Savonarola himself was burned in the Piazza della Signoria, on the very stones where he once preached repentance. Yet his followers, the Piagnoni, or weepers, didn't vanish. They still gather in whispers, holding to his vision of a Florence purified by fire. Not all shadow faiths are born from defiance. Some come from visions. Consider Saint Catherine of Genoa, who spoke of a love of God so consuming it felt like burning. Or Angela of Foligno, whose ecstatic visions blurred the line between divine rapture and erotic union. These mystics were celebrated by some as saints, and eyed by others as dangerously close to heresy. There are stranger stories still, wandering preachers who claimed to have walked with angels, women who delivered sermons while in trances, sects who believed the Holy Spirit had descended on them in a new Pentecost. Were they holy? Or mad? Or simply desperate for a God who felt real in a world of plague and poverty? We walk further, down into the southern quarter, where the streets smell of tanneries and night soil. Here, in the poorest parts of the city, the Fraticelli once preached. They were Franciscan radicals who believed Christ wanted his followers to live in absolute poverty. No gold, no property, no compromise. To them, the church's wealth was blasphemy, its bishops false shepherds. Rome called them heretics. Pope John XXI ordered them hunted. Many were burned. Yet people loved them. They gave away bread, healed the sick, and reminded the poor that Christ himself had walked barefoot. Some still meet in secret, long after their order was broken. It's important to remember, these people didn't all reject Christianity. Most saw themselves as its truest defenders. They weren't trying to destroy the church. They were trying to rebuild it from the ground up. And the church knew this. Which is why their gatherings had to be stamped out, their writings burned, their leaders silenced. Because nothing unnerves an institution more than those who claim to be its purest form. Outside, the woman who brought us here warns us not to speak of what we saw. The Inquisition has ears everywhere. She whispers. She's right. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, there are informants, neighbors, even family, who report suspicious gatherings. Inquisition courts interrogate with fire and iron. And for those branded heretics, there is one end, the stake. One Venetian account describes a hidden congregation betrayed by its own member. They were taken at dawn. It reads, dragged to the square, their mouths gagged with iron. The women wept. The men prayed. The smoke rose. This is the cost of believing differently. We leave the workshop chapel quietly. The night is colder now. Above us, the cathedral looms, its dome lit by moonlight, a reminder of the church's unshakable power. But beneath that dome, in back streets and cellars, another faith grows. One that is rawer, more dangerous. A faith of visions and rebellion. A faith that prays in whispers and sings in secret. And as we walk, you can't help but wonder, how many other doors in this city hide rooms like the one we just left? How many candles are burning tonight for a god Rome would not recognize? Next, we turn from whispered prayers to whispered pleasures. Because when the sun set on Renaissance cities, they belong not to bishops and preachers, but to tavern keepers, brothel madams, and the restless souls seeking escape in the dark. It's time to walk the streets of the Renaissance at night. Step outside. The cathedral bells are silent now. The prayers have been said. The respectable folk have retreated behind locked shutters, their candles snuffed out, their servants bolting the doors. But the city isn't asleep. Not yet. It's just changed faces. This is the hour when the streets come alive for a different congregation. Gamblers, thieves, lovers, and the lost. The people who pray not to saints but to luck, lust, and survival. Come. Keep your hood low, your purse close, and your ears open. We're going to take a walk through the Renaissance after dark. You hear it before you see it. The off-key wail of a lute, the slurred shouting of a drinking song that's more about volume than melody. The door bursts open, and two men tumble out, one laughing, one bleeding from his lip, then stagger off arm in arm like brothers. This is a Florentine tavern, but it could be anywhere, Rome, Venice, Naples. The recipe is the same. Cheap wine. Cheaper company. Tables sticky with spilled ale. Inside, the smell hits you like a fist. Wine, sweat, wood smoke, and the faint tang of piss from the corner where no one bothers with a bucket. The room is a churning mess of men in doublets and rough-cloaked laborers, women in bright scarves who aren't here for piety, and dice players shouting over each other. A fight nearly breaks out when a Venetian merchant accuses a local of cheating at cards. Knives flash briefly, then vanish again as a tavern keeper with forearms like tree trunks slams a jug on the table. "Drink or get out," he says. And they do. The tavern spills into the next street, laughter giving way to a different kind of sound. A woman's giggle, high and practiced. The deep murmur of bargaining. The creak of beds above. This is a brothel. And in Renaissance cities, they weren't hiding. Florence taxed them. Venice regulated them. Even the popes, those paragons of morality, kept the trade alive in Rome, because as one chronicler dryly wrote, "Better the men sin with harlots than trouble the virtuous." Inside you'd find rooms draped with tattered silks, women painted with lead and vermilion, their smiles half warm, half calculated. In Venice, prostitutes wore yellow scarves by law, so clients could find them, and respectable wives could avoid them. And here's the hypocrisy. The same men who railed against sin by day lined up at these doors by night. Merchants, priests, even a few who wore the Medici crest. Walk further. You find an alley humming with low voices. Men squat in a circle, throwing dice on the stones, betting not just coins but shoes, belts, even the clothes off their backs. Gambling was technically illegal in Florence, but it thrived anyway, like a weed through cobblestones. One Venetian diarist wrote of men betting their wives' dowries on a single throw. Another of players who lost everything and walked calmly to the nearest bridge to fling themselves into the canal. It's not just a game. It's a fever. And you can feel it in the way the dice clatter like tiny bones in a tomb. Not all nights are this raw. Sometimes they are gilded. In Venice, particularly during Carnival, the city becomes a stage. Masked figures glide through torchlit streets in costumes that blur gender, class, and identity. A nobleman can drink with a fishmonger. A nun's habit may conceal a courtesan, or a man. Behind those masks, people do things they'd never dare in daylight. Seductions in shadowed alleys, whispered treason in candlelit corners, drunken nobles brawling with gondoliers while musicians play on. It's thrilling, and a little terrifying, because no one is who they seem. But don't let the laughter fool you. Night has teeth. Thieves stalk these streets, knives hidden in sleeves. In Florence, gangs of bravi, hired toughs, patrol the alleys for their patrons, ready to rob or kill for coin. Venice has its ladroni, men who slip into palaces from the canals like ghosts. Rome's night is patrolled not by guards but by banditti, some of them former soldiers with nothing left but their swords and their grudges. And if you do fall victim, forget justice. Night crimes rarely reach the courts. A body found in the gutter at dawn might as well be invisible. There are rumors of stranger entertainments, too, of occult gatherings, where alchemists and mystics drink spiced wine and summon visions by candlelight. Of private salons, where philosophers debate heresies over platters of figs and roast peacock. Of noble orgies, half politics, half pleasure, where alliances are sealed in ways that can't be spoken of in the day. One Venetian letter describes a party where masked guests drank from a silver skull. They called it a joke, the writer says, but I think it was a mass for the devil. It's past midnight now. The taverns are still roaring. The brothels still beckon. But the streets between them grow eerily quiet. You pass a church. The door is shut, but you think you hear singing, low and mournful, from within. This is the Renaissance at night, holy and profane, joyous and brutal, all crammed into the same narrow streets. And as you leave the glow of the torches and step back into the cool dark, you realize, these after-hours worlds, the dice games, the drinking halls, the masked lovers, are as much a part of the Renaissance as Michelangelo's David or Da Vinci's notebooks. Maybe more. Because here, in the night, you see the city without its finery. Raw. Human. Hungry. And that hunger, whether for gold, for pleasure, for power, will take us somewhere even darker. To the places where justice is kept not by reason, but by the sword and the gallows. Dawn breaks pale and cold. The night's revelers are gone, sleeping off wine and sins in taverns or alleyways. The city feels cleaner now, emptier. But the quiet isn't peace. It's anticipation. We're heading toward the public square. And in the Renaissance, that was more than a marketplace or a meeting place. It was a theater of justice, where cities reminded their people who truly held power. The square fills slowly. Bakers arrive first, carrying baskets of bread for sale. Then merchants, pulling up their stalls. But everyone's eyes keep sliding toward the center, toward the wooden platform raised overnight, flanked by guards in striped livery. We join the crowd. No one speaks above a murmur. There's an edge in the air, half curiosity, half dread. A public trial is about to begin. In Florence, they hold them right here, in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. Venice has its own grim stages, near the Doge's palace or by the prisons of the Rialto. In Rome, you'd see it by Castel Sant'Angelo or the Campo de' Fiori. Different cities. Same ritual. A herald steps forward, reading the charges in a voice meant to carry theft, brawling, treason, whatever crime has brought today's unlucky soul before the city. The accused is led out, shackled but standing. There's no pleading, no chance for negotiation. This isn't a courtroom in our modern sense, it's a performance of justice. In Florence, the Gonfalonier, the city's highest magistrate, may appear, robed in crimson, to preside. In Venice, masked members of the Council of Ten might observe from a balcony, their faces unreadable. Their presence is the real sentence, the weight of the state, embodied in men who never smile. You notice something curious. There's no lawyer, no defense as we'd imagine it. The trial is a formality. The verdict was likely decided days ago. But the ritual matters. Justice must be seen to be done. Here's where Renaissance justice surprises you. It isn't always the gallows. Petty thieves might be whipped or branded. Some are marched through the streets wearing iron collars, shamed into obedience rather than destroyed. Debtors spend time in stocks, their neighbors free to scold or jeer. Even for serious crimes, death wasn't always the goal. Exile was common, banishing troublemakers to the countryside, cutting them off from the city's lifeblood. But for treason, for heresy, for crimes that threatened not just people but the order of the city, the punishment was public, final, and meant to be remembered. The platform creaks. The guards shift. People stand on their toes to see. It's not chaos. No one's screaming. This isn't a lynch mob. It's solemn. Ritualized. In Florence, the condemned might kneel beneath the shadow of the palazzo. In Venice, they'd be led across the Bridge of Sighs, emerging onto the Piazzetta for their final moment. Clergy stand by, murmuring last prayers. The crowd watches silently, as though this is less punishment and more purification, a way to cleanse the city of whatever disorder this person brought. Then it's over. Swift. And the crowd exhales as one. To us, it feels grim. But to them, it was civic duty. Public justice told the people, laws are real. Order is maintained. Chaos will be answered. And in an age of feuding families, mercenary gangs, and corrupt officials, that mattered. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about convincing everyone else that the city still had control. The crowd disperses slowly. Merchants return to their stalls. Children chatter as though they didn't just watch a man's fate sealed. The platform is already being dismantled. Soon it'll be just another market square. You walk away thoughtful. In the Renaissance, justice wasn't private or clinical. It was performative. It reminded everyone, rich or poor, citizen or outsider, that the city had teeth. And yet, as the morning sun warms the stones, the same square where sentences are carried out will soon host festivals, weddings, and sermons. Because that was the Renaissance way, to mix beauty and brutality, mercy and severity, until they felt like parts of the same whole. Next, we leave the square for a quieter kind of reckoning. Not in the courts, but in the chapels and studios where artists wrestled with death itself, turning the plague, the gallows, and the fragility of life into frescoes, poems, and marble saints. It's time to explore the art of death. The square fades behind us, its echo of justice replaced by a softer, stranger silence. We walk through narrow streets until we reach a heavy wooden door set into the wall of a Renaissance church. It creaks open, and a wave of cool, incense-tinged air washes over us. Step inside. This is not the dazzling, sunlit church you expect from a postcard of Florence or Rome. This is a quieter place. Dim light filters through stained glass. Candles gutter near a side altar. The air smells of beeswax and old stone. And everywhere you see death. The first thing your eyes catch isn't a saint or a Madonna. It's a skull, painted into the corner of a fresco, perched on a stone ledge, staring blankly back at you. This is memento mori, art meant to remind the viewer, you, too, will die. Look closer at the paintings on the walls. See how often they slit death into the frame, a skeleton dancing beside a nobleman, a rosary carved with tiny skulls, a Virgin Mary not holding a child, but looking down upon plague victims, her face serene, theirs contorted in agony. It isn't morbid for morbid's sake. It's meant to wake you up, to remind you that life is fragile, that eternity is closer than you think. Come, look at this mural along the side chapel wall. Figures line up in a grim parade, a pope, a king, a merchant, a peasant. Between them, skeletons, grinning, cavorting, leading them all in the same dance. This is the danse macabre, a theme that spread across Renaissance Europe. No matter your wealth, your power, your learning, death will take your hand in the end. It was painted in churches, carved on tombs, even performed as morality plays in public squares. It was entertainment and sermon all at once, art that laughed at pride and whispered of humility. Walk deeper into the nave. See those tombs along the walls, effigies of men in armor, hands folded in prayer. They look peaceful, don't they? Now look lower. Many tombs of this era have two layers. Above, the nobleman in eternal repose. Below, a second carving of the same man, but as a decayed corpse, worms crawling through his ribs. It's called a transite tomb. The message is clear. This is what power, beauty, and glory become. Stand there a moment. Imagine being a wealthy merchant kneeling here at prayer, staring at that stone corpse. It makes even the proudest soul pause. Now we leave the church and step into another sacred space, an artist's workshop. The smell of linseed oil and ground pigments hits you. Light slants in through high windows, catching on jars of powdered lapis lazuli, ochre, and vermilion. A half-finished painting leans on the easel. It's a Madonna, yes, but in the background, there's a city in ruins, smoke rising, plague carts rolling through streets. It's not sacrilege. It's honesty. Artists of the Renaissance didn't shy away from the world's horror. They wove it into beauty, frescoes of saints dying in agony, altarpieces of Judgment Day filled with writhing souls, chiaroscuro portraits that make faces look half alive, half ghost. You can feel it. This isn't art for decoration. It's art for reckoning. Humanists like Pico della Mirandola wrote of man as a creature poised between beast and angel, capable of rising to the divine, or falling to ruin. These artists put that tension in color and marble. Look at the way Michelangelo sculpted the Medici tombs. Serene faces, yes, but bodies twisted as though caught between life and decay. Or how Holbein slipped a stretched-out skull into the bottom of his ambassadors, visible only if you view it from the right angle, like death itself, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't morbid fascination. It was Renaissance realism, an admission that to celebrate life, you must also face death. The plague bells rang for decades. Executions took place in public squares. Children died young. Even popes didn't live past their 50s. And yet, these people painted, sculpted, wrote. They built domes that scraped heaven, composed madrigals for lovers, carved epitaphs that made mourners weep. Why? Because facing death gave them urgency. Every brushstroke, every poem, every marble saint was an act of defiance. We are mortal, but we will leave something that isn't. We leave the studio as the light fades. Behind us, the church grows quiet, its skulls and skeletons staring eternally. Ahead, the streets of Florence, or Venice, or Rome, carry on with their living chaos. This is the Renaissance paradox, a world haunted by death, yet obsessed with life. A culture that stared into the grave and decided to build cathedrals anyway. And as we walk, one thought lingers, maybe that's what made their art immortal. Next, we'll see the tension between this mortality-soaked art and the gilded hypocrisy of its patrons. Because while artists painted memento mori, their sponsors feasted in palaces, funding masterpieces with one hand while letting their cities starve with the other. It's time to confront those contradictions. The door swings open, and we are not in a church anymore. We are in a palace. The air is warm, perfumed with rosewater and roasted meat. Candles drip from golden candelabras, their flames dancing across frescoed ceilings that depict gods and saints. Harpsichord music drifts from a corner, polite and delicate, masking the hum of dozens of conversations. Welcome to a Medici banquet hall, a world so gilded, so indulgent, that it feels like another planet entirely. Look at this table. It stretches the length of the hall, covered in linen so white it seems to glow. Platters overflow with roast pheasant, honey-glazed fruits, and marzipan molded into sculptures of mythical beasts. Servants pour wine from silver pitchers into crystal goblets, bowing so low you wonder if they'll fall over. At the head sits a Medici, a man whose name carries more weight in Florence than the Gonfaloniers or even the popes. He leans back, ringed fingers idly stroking his beard as poets recite verses in his honor, and courtiers laugh too loudly at his jokes. And surrounding him, artists, philosophers, bankers, clerics. This is what it means to be a patron. To gather the city's brightest minds, feed them like royalty, and in exchange demand something greater than food, immortality in paint, marble, and ink. Every fresco on these walls, every sculpture in the courtyard, none of it came from divine inspiration alone. It came from patronage. The Medici bankrolled Michelangelo, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci. They didn't just fund art, they commissioned it, guided it, dictated its themes. In Florence, art wasn't simply beauty. It was politics, legacy, propaganda. When Cosimo de' Medici ordered the construction of San Lorenzo, it wasn't piety, it was branding. When Lorenzo the Magnificent filled his palace with Neoplatonic philosophers, it wasn't idle curiosity, it was power, the kind that outlives mortal flesh. And yet outside these walls, step with me out the side door. The music muffles, replaced by the distant bark of a mongrel and the murmur of the city's purr settling into their night. We are in the same Florence, but it feels like a different century. Here, families of 6 cram into single rooms, the stink of tanneries and sewage thick in the air. Street children sleep beneath arcades, bellies empty, watching servants carry scraps back to the palace kitchens. This is the contradiction of the Renaissance. Michelangelo's David rises in the square, while beggars die in its shadow. And what of the church? Walk with me to a chapel paid for by this very family. The walls glimmer with lapis blue Madonnas and gold leaf saints. These works are breathtaking, and also indulgences in pigment and stone. Clergy preach charity from pulpits while selling salvation for coin. Popes lived like emperors, throwing feasts that dwarfed anything the Medicis could imagine. Rome, the eternal city, reeked of incense and of hypocrisy. One Venetian chronicler wrote, "The poor are the stones upon which these temples are built." He wasn't wrong. And yet the artists stayed. Why? Because they had little choice. To paint frescoes, to carve marble, to live without hunger, you needed a patron. And if that meant turning your brush to glorify the very men who taxed peasants into starvation, so be it. Leonardo da Vinci once sketched machines of war for his patrons, writing in his notebooks, "He who does not offend the powerful cannot speak truth." Was that resignation? Or survival? Step back into the hall one last time. The Medici raises a goblet. The poets toast him as Pater Patri, Father of the Fatherland. The musicians play louder. The smell of roast meat and spiced wine overwhelms the air. And for a moment, you almost forget the slums outside. That's the genius of it. This art, this pageantry, it wasn't just decoration. It was a veil, a way to sanctify wealth, to paint over power with the brushstrokes of beauty. This was the Renaissance bargain: glory for the patrons, survival for the artists, scraps for the rest. As we leave the banquet, The night feels colder. The city is quiet again, but the contradictions linger. The Renaissance gave us David and the Sistine Chapel, but it also gave us debtors' prisons, plague slums, and sermons twisted into fundraising campaigns. And perhaps that's why its art still feels alive, because it came from a world not of pure beauty, but of sharp, unresolvable tension. Next, we leave the halls of the wealthy and return to the shadows. Not to the patrons of Florence or the popes of Rome, but to the ones who worked in secret laboratories, where lead could become gold, where sickness might be cured with a single drop of elixir. It's time to step back into the alchemist's workshop, this time, for a deeper dive into its mysteries. We've been here before, remember? The first time, we crept through a heavy door into one man's strange sanctum. But this time, we're traveling. We're going to visit 3 workshops across Italy, each different in its purpose, each shaped by the people who fund them. Because in the Renaissance, alchemy wasn't just one man in a smoky room. It was a network of furnaces and philosophies, stretching from the poorest herbalist's cellar to the gilded laboratories of kings. We begin in Florence, behind a narrow house in the San Lorenzo quarter. Push open the shutters and duck inside. The room smells of burned rosemary, vinegar, and a hint of wine gone sour. This is no noble laboratory. It's an artisan's workshop, lined with shelves of clay jars labeled in hurried Latin, arsenicum, sulfur, sal ammoniac. The man who works here isn't rich. He's a practical alchemist, selling distilled spirits for apothecaries, cheap gold-tinted glass for the church down the street, and the occasional love potion for those who can't resist superstition. But don't mistake him for a simple tradesman. On his worktable lies a worn copy of the Corpus Hermeticum, translated by Marsilio Ficino, the same text the Medicis devoured. He believes his labor serves a higher purpose: to purify the base into the divine, as he mutters while grinding cinnabar in a mortar. He serves no great patron. His sponsors are merchants who want practical results: brighter dyes, stronger metals, maybe even a new medicine for their children. This is alchemy as survival. Knowledge for hire. Now to Venice, where water laps against the walls of a palazzo near the Grand Canal. Inside, the scene changes. This laboratory is opulent. The ceiling beams are carved with lions. Glass alembics shimmer like captured raindrops. There's a small furnace room tiled in green and white, its heat radiating like a forge of secrets. Here, alchemy is commerce. Venice thrives on trade: spices from the east, silks from Byzantium, rare minerals from as far as Africa. And this alchemist, bankrolled by a merchant prince, turns those imports into profit. He experiments with colored glass for Murano, concocts new cosmetics for Venetian courtesans, even refines mercury for gilding statues. But in the quiet hours, when his patron isn't looking, he works on something else: aurum potable, drinkable gold. A liquid elixir said to cure disease, sharpen the mind, even prolong life. His patron thinks of gold as currency. The alchemist dreams of it as eternal youth in a cup. And finally, Rome. This workshop isn't hidden. It's inside a palace, a gift from a cardinal with more wealth than piety. Here, alchemy isn't about survival or profit. It's about power and immortality. The walls are frescoed with astrological charts and Hebrew script. Candles burn in iron sconces, throwing light on shelves of Egyptian papyri, Kabbalistic treatises, and notebooks filled with indecipherable codes. This is a courtly laboratory, modeled after those that would later flourish under Emperor Rudolph II in Prague, a blend of alchemy, astrology, and Christian mysticism. The alchemist here doesn't serve merchants or apothecaries. He serves politics. His experiments aim to secure his patron's health, enhance his influence, perhaps even produce that legendary philosopher's stone. The cardinal visits at night, watching molten metals swirl in crucibles, whispering prayers that sound more like bargains than devotions. Across all these places, alchemists share one thing: the language of fire. The bellows hum. The furnaces glow red. Metals hiss as they meet acids. It's violent, beautiful work, turning solid into liquid, liquid into vapor, vapor back into solid, like matter breathing. Every stage has an aim. Nigredo, blackening, burning away the corrupt. Albedo, whitening, purifying what remains. Citrinitas, yellowing, awakening the material's inner life. Rubedo, reddening, final perfection. The goal? Not just to make gold, but to mirror the cosmos, to achieve transformation within the self. Notice the books on their shelves. Many are written in green language, coded symbols that protect secrets from prying eyes. Alchemy isn't just chemistry, it's theater. A ritual. A performance meant only for the initiated. The Venetian alchemist says, "Our words are clouds. The truth lies behind them." And he's right. Without the key, these diagrams of snakes, suns, and interlocking circles mean nothing. You may ask, why would merchants, cardinals, even princes bankroll this? Because alchemists promised everything the Renaissance elite wanted most. Gold, wealth, elixirs, health, prophecy, control over fate, immortality, the ultimate escape. Even the skeptics couldn't resist the hope that somewhere, in one of these furnaces, the secret to conquering death might exist. We leave the last workshop at dawn. The air outside smells sweeter, fresher, after hours in those smoky rooms. Each alchemist we met was different, an artisan in Florence, a merchant chemist in Venice, a philosopher-magician in Rome. But all shared a hunger deeper than coin, to master nature, to reshape the world, to make the mortal divine. As the sun rises, you can't help but wonder, how much of the Renaissance's so-called magic was just this, the collision of desperate patrons, restless minds, and fire? Next, we leave the men with their crucibles and turn to the ones the church feared most, the outsiders. Witches, healers, midwives, mystics. The ones who work not for palaces or popes, but for the people in the streets. The roads out of Florence are narrow, muddy, and quiet. We've left the frescoed halls of the Medicis and the smoky laboratories of their alchemists. Now we're walking toward the edges, to the people history only whispers about. The ones who don't appear in guild records or papal letters. The ones the church didn't know how to name except with one word, outsiders. Our first stop is in the Apennine foothills, in a hamlet so small it doesn't appear on any map. The air here smells of pine and damp earth. An old woman lives in a hut at the edge of the woods. People call her Striga, witch. Step inside, and it's not a den of Satan. It's a kitchen. Bundles of herbs hang from the rafters, sage, rue, fennel. A pot simmers over the hearth, filling the room with the sharp tang of garlic and vinegar. She brews salves for aching joints, teas for fevers, charms for protection against the evil eye. Her magic is botany and memory, knowledge passed from mother to daughter for generations. But when a child recovers after her poultice, they say she's blessed. When one dies despite her care, they say she's cursed. It's a fragile line, and one she walks every day. Next, we're back in the city, Florence, Venice, Rome, it doesn't matter. The plague does not discriminate. Here, in a tenement that smells of sweat and rosemary smoke, we find a midwife. She's kneeling beside a straw bed where a woman labors in childbirth, whispering prayers as she works. Midwives were the quiet heroes of the Renaissance, delivering babies, tending to women's health, preparing remedies for the poor. They knew the female body better than most university-trained physicians. But their power made them vulnerable. The church feared them. Male doctors resented them. A rumor of heresy, or of consorting with spirits, could turn their healing hands into evidence of witchcraft. And so, in plague years, when the dead piled up and grief demanded a scapegoat, many midwives found themselves at the mercy of inquisitors. Now, into a dark Venetian alley. The stones are slick with mist from the canals, the smell of brine mixing with tallow smoke. A man waits here, cloaked, his wares hidden in a bundle, talismans carved with strange symbols, vials of fragrant oils, packets of powders. He's what they call a cunning man, a street-level magician who sells luck, love charms, and sometimes a curse or two. Superstition thrives where certainty fails. A fisherman pays him for a token to keep storms away. A courtesan buys a charm to hold on to her patron's favor. A grieving mother gives her last coins for a spell to keep her surviving children alive. Are these frauds? Or rituals of hope for people with nothing else? In the Renaissance, maybe it doesn't matter. These outsiders were more than healers and charm makers. They were storytellers, keepers of the old ways, blending Christian prayers with pagan rites, weaving saints into ancient forest spirits. In mountain villages, people still left offerings at sacred springs, whispering to old gods reborn as local saints. In city alleys, cunning folk recited psalms while tracing occult sigils onto talismans. It wasn't heresy to them. It was survival. A way to live in a world where God often felt distant, but spirits, good or bad, were always near. But Renaissance tolerance had its limits. As the Inquisition grew sharper, so did its gaze. Accusations of witchcraft spread like wildfire, often against these very people. The women who knew too much about herbs, the midwives who dared to ease pain in childbirth, the cunning men whose prayers didn't match the church's Latin. Some were interrogated. Some burned. Many simply vanished from the records. The mountain which we visited? Maybe she lives out her days quietly. Or maybe one winter evening, someone reports her for making packs. And the midwife? Maybe she delivers another child safely. Or maybe she's hauled to a square, accused of spreading plague through her touch. In this world, knowledge and danger walked hand in hand. We leave them behind, the Striga in her hut, the midwife in her plague-ridden tenement, the cunning man in his misty alley. They are invisible in the frescoes of great halls, absent from the poems of courtly patrons. But without them, the Renaissance doesn't work. They healed the poor when no one else would. They kept alive the older, stranger threads of belief. They were scapegoats when cities needed someone to blame, and lifelines when cities had no one else to call. And their stories remind us that the Renaissance wasn't just the rebirth of beauty. It was also a clash of worlds, old and new, sanctioned and forbidden, sacred and profane. Next, we widen our lens. Because while Florence, Venice, and Rome were remaking themselves, they were not alone. The Ottoman Empire, Ming China, and the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age were reshaping the world too, and their influence reached deeper into the Renaissance than most care to admit. We've been walking Florence's alleys, wandering Venice's canals, listening to Rome's sermons and secrets. But the Renaissance was never just Italian. It was a crossroads, and its brilliance was fed by paths that began far beyond these walls. So tonight, we're leaving Italy. We're taking a journey east and south, tracing the currents of knowledge and wealth that breathed life into this so-called rebirth. Pack lightly. The road is long. Our first stop, Istanbul. The city hums like a living artery, connecting continents. It smells of cardamom, roasting lamb, and brine from the Bosphorus. Minarets pierce the sky, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. This is the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire, and its sultans are not just warriors, they are patrons of knowledge. Inside Topkapi Palace, courtiers in embroidered kaftans walk among tiled halls that glitter like jewels. Scholars debate astronomy and theology in its gardens. In nearby madrasas, students copy texts from Arabic into Turkish and Persian, translations of Plato, Galen, and Avicenna that Europe would later rediscover through trade and conquest. The Ottomans preserved much of the Greek and Roman legacy Europe had lost, and added their own insights. From them came new surgical techniques, refined maps, and innovations in architecture that made Florence's domes possible. And merchants? They carried silks, spices, and manuscripts westward, their caravans bringing not just goods, but ideas, slipping them into Europe like contraband treasures. Next, we ride south through the sands. In Cairo, the Mamluks still hold court. Their city teems with scholars who gather in the shadow of Al-Azhar University, one of the world's oldest centers of learning. Here, Greek philosophy is studied alongside Quranic law, mathematics alongside poetry. Further west, across the Sahara, lies Timbuktu, not a myth, but a marvel. In its Sankor libraries, tens of thousands of manuscripts sit in neat stacks, treatises on astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. The pages smell of ink and desert air, written in elegant Arabic script. Caravans carry these manuscripts north to Mediterranean ports, where they'll eventually be traded, stolen, or gifted into European hands. Some will find their way into the collections of the Medici or the Vatican, silently shaping the minds of men like Leonardo and Copernicus. Now to the east, across oceans and mountains, to Ming-era China. It is another Renaissance, though they wouldn't call it that. Walk through the gates of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Vermilion walls, golden roofs, courtyards so vast they seem to hold their own weather. Here, the Yongle Emperor commissioned the Yongle Encyclopedia, an attempt to gather all human knowledge into a single work, centuries before Europe would dream of such a thing. Chinese artisans refine porcelain and silk with techniques Italy desperately tries to imitate. Their printers mass-produce books using movable type long before Gutenberg. Their engineers invent rockets and navigational compasses, tools that European sailors will later use to map the world. And on the coasts? Fleets under Jinghe, massive treasure ships larger than anything Europe has floated, sail across the Indian Ocean, establishing trade routes that bring tea, porcelain, and ideas to ports Venetian merchants will frequent. Back in Venice, you can see all of this converge. A merchant's warehouse near the Rialto holds Ming porcelain. A surgeon reads an Arabic translation of Galen. A monk copies texts rescued from Constantinople after its fall in 1453. Even numerals, those handy digits we now take for granted, came not from Rome, but from India, carried by Arab scholars into Europe. The Italian Renaissance is stitched together from threads that began in Delhi, Cairo, and Samarkand. And the Italians? They made a tapestry from them. When we talk of the Renaissance, we picture Florence's domes and Venetian canals. But those domes owe debts to Ottoman architects, those canals to trade routes guarded by Muslim fleets, those frescoes to pigments brought across deserts and seas. The Renaissance wasn't a rebirth out of nothing. It was a gathering of old wisdom preserved elsewhere, of new ideas carried on ships and camels, of cultures colliding and transforming each other. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Florence of the Medicis is not just Florentine. It is Ottoman, Persian, Chinese, African. It is a city built on borrowed brilliance. As we walk back toward Italy in our minds, the Renaissance feels different now. The piazzas and palaces aren't isolated wonders. They are echoes of conversations that span the globe, between East and West, between desert and city, between faiths that clashed and quietly exchanged gifts. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the hum of Istanbul's scholars, the scratching of quills in Timbuktu, the rustle of silk in Beijing, all of it woven into the sound of a Florentine workshop hammering out its next masterpiece. Next, we turn from what we know to what we don't. Because for all its brilliance, the Renaissance hid its share of shadows, lost manuscripts, secret codes, and figures who slipped out of history, leaving behind only questions. It's past midnight. We're back in Florence, or perhaps Venice, or Rome. It hardly matters. The Renaissance always feels more honest at this hour, when the merchants have gone home and the scholars have stopped arguing and the streets whisper secrets. And tonight, we're hunting those whispers. The things the Renaissance left half-finished, half-hidden. The mysteries that sit between the lines of history, still waiting for someone to read them. We begin in a library. It smells of parchment, dust, and the faint musk of old leather bindings. The candles here are burned low. Their light glows on chained books that haven't been touched in centuries. On a table lies a manuscript written in what scholars call the green language, an alchemist's cipher. Spirals of symbols. Drawings of suns devouring moons. Letters rearranged into puzzles no one can quite solve. Many of these manuscripts were written to conceal knowledge from the uninitiated, recipes for elixirs, rituals for transformation, notes on forbidden experiments. Some, like the famous Voynich manuscript, are still undeciphered. Who wrote them? What do they say? No one knows. Maybe they were encoded for secrecy. Or maybe, as some suggest, they're elaborate frauds, hoaxes meant to lure rich patrons. Either way, they hum with a quiet defiance. You are not meant to understand me. Then there are the texts that vanished entirely. We know they existed, scholars reference them, copy fragments, but their pages are gone. Leonardo da Vinci's missing notebooks. Hermetic treatises lost after the fall of Constantinople. Medieval grimoires burned by the Inquisition, their knowledge reduced to smoke. What did they contain? Perhaps nothing more than musings and sketches. Or perhaps, as rumors insist, recipes for philosophers' stones, instructions for mechanical marvels centuries ahead of their time, maps to worlds not yet found. In Venice, merchants still whisper of crates of manuscripts stolen from Constantinople's libraries in 1453, hidden in vaults or sold to collectors who kept their secrets buried with them. Do you hear that? It's the sound of a door creaking in a cellar. The secret societies we visited earlier, the proto-masons, the hermetic circles, the Rosicrucian forerunners, they didn't all die with their founders. Some simply slipped underground, their names lost, their rituals scattered in whispers. In Florence, they say certain confraternities used coded prayers, half psalm, half spell, to pass forbidden ideas without the Inquisition noticing. In Rome, rumors claim that certain cardinals belonged to mystical brotherhoods, their vows sealed in silence. Even now, scholars find hints in letters, references to unnamed orders, half-described rites, invisible hands shaping politics in the shadows. Who were they? What did they protect? Did their work survive? We can only guess. Even the people we think we know, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Botticelli, still guard their secrets. Take Leonardo. His notebooks are riddled with mirror writing, a left-handed script running backward, readable only in a reflection. Why? Was it simply habit? Or a deliberate act of concealment? Or Botticelli's mystic nativity, painted in 1500, filled with angels and demons and an apocalyptic inscription warning of the end times? Was it just art? Or a coded message about Florence's political turmoil under Savonarola? The more you look, the more you realize, Renaissance masterpieces aren't just art, they're puzzles. And then there are the rumors. Of a philosopher's stone actually created, but hidden, lost when its maker died suddenly. Of forbidden love letters buried in convent walls. Of undiscovered Da Vinci inventions sleeping in sealed Florentine vaults. Historians dismiss them. But they dismiss a lot of things, until someone digs them up. We close the manuscript. The candles burn low. Some mysteries are unsolvable. Some are only waiting for the right eyes, the right key. And some, perhaps, are meant to stay in the dark. But as we leave the library, the streets feel different. As though the city itself is keeping secrets. And maybe that's the real lesson of these unsolved mysteries. The Renaissance isn't finished. It still holds doors we haven't opened. Next we step back, far back. From the mysteries, from the paintings, from the feasts and the gallows, to look at the Renaissance whole. Its light, its darkness, and what it left behind for us. The sky is pale gray, just beginning to soften to blue. We're walking through Florence again, or Venice or Rome. At this hour, they all feel the same. Streets washed in silence. Stones still cold from the night. A baker rolls open his shutters, the smell of yeast and wood smoke spilling into the street. A monk shuffles by with his cowl drawn low, lips moving in quiet prayer. A woman sweeps her stoop, chasing away the debris of yesterday. The city is waking. And as it does, so do the memories of where we've been. We've seen its brilliance, cathedrals rising like prayers, paintings that still breathe 5 centuries later, philosophies that gave Europe a new voice. But we've seen the shadows too, slums where children starved in the glow of palatial banquets, gallows that turned justice into spectacle, fires that consumed heretics, whose only crime was thinking differently. The Renaissance was never pure light. It was contrast, glory and suffering, science and superstition, beauty and brutality coexisting in the same streets. It wasn't a golden age. It was a complicated one. And yet, so much of our modern world still lives in its echoes. Science, born in the furnaces of alchemists. Individualism, carved into marble by artists who dared sign their names to their works. Globalism, nurtured by merchants who brought the East into the West through silks, spices, and ideas. Even our obsession with immortality, whether through medicine, art, or technology, feels like the same fire that drove Renaissance patrons to commission frescoes, codices, and tombs designed to outlast their mortal flesh. When we wrestle with knowledge versus faith, progress versus morality, beauty versus justice, we are still walking their streets. Look up. The sun breaks over the rooftops, gilding the domes and towers in gold. It's easy to imagine Lorenzo the Magnificent once standing at a window at this very hour, or a nameless midwife hurrying home after a night of saving lives, or a painter stumbling out of his workshop, hands stained with the colors of angels. The city exhales. A new day begins. And you realize, this is the true legacy of the Renaissance, not the art or the inventions, but the human hunger behind them. The hunger to create in the face of death. To seek knowledge in the face of danger. To live fully, even in a world that could snuff you out in an instant. We leave the square as its life returns, vendors calling out prices, children chasing stray dogs, bells ringing for Massachusetts. The Renaissance isn't behind us. It walks with us, stitched into our philosophies, our cities, our art, our contradictions. And as we turn the last corner, one thought lingers like the echo of those church bells. If they could create so much beauty in their dark and uncertain times, what excuse do we have in ours? And so, as the sun fully rises, we leave the Renaissance behind, not as a museum piece, but as a living companion. A reminder that light and darkness often share the same street, and that every rebirth carries its shadows. The streets are awake now, but we don't need to follow them. We find a quiet bench at the edge of the square, where the city hums softly, the clatter of hooves on stone, the murmur of merchants arranging their wares, the distant bell of a church calling the faithful to morning prayer. And we sit, not as travelers, not as scholars, but simply as listeners. Because the Renaissance, for all its color and noise, is best understood in its silences, the ones between the grand gestures. We've walked its plague-ridden alleys and candlelit taverns. We've stood in its banquet halls, beneath ceilings painted to impress men who feared being forgotten. We've read its coded manuscripts, traced the outlines of vanished brotherhoods, listened to the whispers of its outsiders, the midwife, the cunning man, the mountain witch. We've seen it in its light and in its darkness. And now, as the last candle of our journey burns low, we realize the Renaissance was never just a time. It was a question. What can we become? What can we make of ourselves, of our world, of our fleeting lives? As the wind carries the smell of bread baking in some distant kitchen, we close our eyes. The voices of that age, artists and alchemists, heretics and holy men, settle around us like a warm cloak. Their fears, their hopes, their contradictions, not so different from ours. And maybe that's the final gift of this journey, to see that we've always been the same. Fragile, brilliant, searching. So take a deep breath. Let the city's hum fade. And as the Renaissance slips quietly back into the past, let its echoes guide you, not with noise, but with a whisper. Build something that lasts. Seek beyond what is safe. live fully, even in the shadows. And so, as the night settles, not in the streets of Florence, but in our own time, may these echoes of the past guide you gently into dreams.